Ms. Graham.
Thank you. I know that the inquiry team will be making contact with the Professional Standards Department, but I'm wondering if there's something else you could maybe help me with, and please feel free to say if you don't know the answer to this. When you were in the role of SIO, or you conduct that role as part of an investigation, and in this case when officers were gathered together in the canteen, was it open to you as an SIO to make contact with Professional Standards and maybe access the disciplinary records of individual officers, or to check that out as part of your investigation?
Potentially at some point, not at that particular time. Obviously, if I was allowed or if I was to remain involved in the investigation, it potentially would have been a consideration. Again, if there was justification rationale for that.
You've said that there's certain generic things that you do as part of an investigation. We looked at page 1 of your day book, and you had a number of them listed. We went through that in detail. Is that the type of thing that you could access as part of an investigation, checking the records of individual officers?
When there's complaints made against the police, yes, at that stage we were dealing with an incident involving the police contact, so perhaps not my first consideration, but as the inquiry progressed, that may have fallen within the parameters, yes.
And is that the type of information that you could gather in, or have gathered in other investigations, where you did talk about gathering in information and data on the individuals involved?
For the intelligence profiles, I think specifically in terms of civilian witnesses, again, if it was prudent that we needed any background information on the officers, then perhaps, and again as part of that profile, would have given information around any previous allegations, any use of force, etc.
Right. In terms of timescale, had you been continuing in your role as SIO in May 2015, would you have, what sort of timescale would you have started thinking about looking into the officers' disciplinary records and complaints that had been made, or whether there'd been complaints made?
Again, I think obviously I wasn't involved as it progressed, but there were witnesses at that time, so I don't know it actively, or it would be the first consideration to go and get their profile in terms of any previous complaints, because at that time we weren't dealing with a complaint against the police.
So at that stage, not something you considered on the 3rd of May when you were SIO. And can you envisage what the circumstances would be which would prompt that action to be taken?
So again, if there was a complaint about the police relating to a subject officer, I would look, if that was the investigation I was dealing with, I would look for the background information in terms of previous complaint history. But obviously, in the aftermath and early stage of that there was no information to suggest any wrongdoing or any overt act on the part of the officers, hence why they were treated as witnesses.
We've heard that, just asking a little bit more about what would constitute a complaint against the police, we've heard some evidence that there was, and you've said yourself that you were aware in the afternoon when the officers went to the Johnsons to deliver the death message, that the possibility or concerns about racism being a possible motivating factor for the events at Hayfield Road was raised by the family. Would that be sufficient to constitute a complaint against the police, or would you be looking for something more than that?
Yeah, I think at that stage it was the views being expressed, obviously in the absence of any information in regards to it. I think if complaints are made in general terms, that we would have to maybe explore the provenance of it, in terms of if there was any inference of criminality or wrongdoing on the part of the officers. So people have made statements previously and expressed their dissatisfaction. That doesn't necessarily immediately conclude that it's a complaint. But again, that's part of the communication with those individuals.
So would you have expected something a little bit more formal than just expressing concerns?
In terms of us to progress a complaint against the police, but again, it's not uncommon that if we've been investigating an incident and as part of that somebody wants to make a complaint against the police, that was something that we would probably signpost them to, because again it would have to be considered and investigated by someone different from who the complaint is against.
So the complaint itself would be investigated separately,
Yeah.
but in terms of you as an SIO accessing disciplinary records, that is something that could have been done at a later stage in the investigation.
If circumstances dictated, yes.
Thank you. Can I ask you about, we were talking earlier before lunch about Alan Payton, and I think the paragraph that I referred you to in your inquiry statement was 31, and I think it may have been the first inquiry statement, or maybe not. Oh, thank you so much. So this was a part of the first inquiry statement in relation to race, and we talked about Alan Payton earlier. And when you were explaining what your views were about Alan Payton, one of the things that you said was they were linked to agendas yesterday. And I think that was a reference maybe to the use of the word agenda yesterday, which we dealt with in the afternoon. Can I ask you again about the use of the word agendas? If anyone raises an issue of racism in relation to actions of the police, and when I mean raises an issue of racism, specifically saying or suggesting that actions of the police have been influenced in some way by racist attitudes or motivations. And on occasion, there may be an immediate comeback saying, well, that's a racist agenda. Do you understand what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that agenda could be a suggestion of the family are raising race as an issue, or you understand where I'm coming from. Would you agree that that could be viewed as quite a dismissive attitude, which the effect of which is to undermine the value of the point made by the family, suggesting that racism could be an issue?
Yeah, I accept that, and obviously we discussed the use of the word and how that can be perceived. I think in the context of what we said yesterday is that, did I feel personally for the officers as this progressed, knowing that there was stuff out there in the media that included matters linked then, in that case, to their private life. And as I say, it was just my express of the empathy for the officers that this was being out in the public domain. And there could be every right for that. I'm allowed to feel a bit of empathy for the officers that with their private life and families that it was naturally going to have an impact, whether it to be founded or otherwise.
When we've heard about the family on the afternoon of the 3rd of May raising the issue of racism potentially having been a factor in the death of Mr. Bayo, were you aware of any officers expressing the view that this was an agenda on the part of the family, or that was somehow not a genuine concern, but simply an agenda that they had?
No, I would never correlate that with the feedback from the officer that had been there, that was the position in view of, or the immediate position in view of the family, and then they're entitled to their opinion based on, well, at that time, the lack of information that they'd been given.
In considering the views of the family, were you aware that these views were dismissed to some extent by being portrayed, those views being portrayed as part of an agenda
And dismissed by who, sorry?
Dismissed by officers?
No, because I think, well, it's me, it's included the word in my statement. Again, I've explained that, but we never tried to dismiss the views or position of the family, because that was the whole part of the investigation, if those views and observations, positions would be founded, supported, or in fact, if it was unfounded.
And so, having been aware on the 3rd of May that this was something that had been raised by the family, and on the basis it wasn't dismissed as some sort of agenda, what steps were put in place to respond to those concerns at that time?
I couldn't tell you because I wasn't involved, but I suppose it would be, again, at the early stages, that in the hope that a full and thorough investigation would provide potential outcomes in terms of the reasons, and we talked about the hypothesis, why did this take place, how did this take place, and any outcome from that.
So if you had been continuing in the role of SIO on a longer term basis than you've said you were, what would you personally have expected to be done with regard to investigating these concerns on the part of the family, that racism was a factor?
So again, I think as part of that, keeping that open mind, that it would have been fully considered along with every other potential element.
And in relation to possible racism, what particular steps or actions would you have instructed as SIO to consider specifically the question of race?
Again, it would probably be to get a better understanding, and again, that would be used through the investigative arm of the flows. So again, I've been involved in a number of incidents where family have raised issues and sought clarity. Again, that is the concept and purpose of the family liaison officer being deployed to create that relationship. One, from the investigative perspective, because there's information that would require from the family as part of any investigation, but also as that point of contact and understanding any issues. Again, it's fed back in, and if I'm not in control of how to explore that, then potentially bringing in some form of specialism, skill to better understand and explore that. So I think as part of the investigation, we look for some form of equality and diversity coordinator or consultant in effect. And they would have advise us accordingly, having gained the information from the family, as how we best explore and potentially evidence that.
And would that equality and diversity consultant be a member of the police, or would it be someone who was seconded into the police to assist?
So again, I know we have, and again, maybe not a consultant, but we do have the kind of coordinator, and through our Safer Communities department at that time, had access to a department that had a broader knowledge and a more expert knowledge than us. If it was something that needed to potentially be evidence, we may look for independence advisory support.
Where would you access that?
It would be through our partners, against the provision of, so we do have specialisms nationally and across the UK, that no doubt there would be a conduit through partners to identify the person best placed for that.
And engaging the services of a consultant or an independent advisory support, would that be the responsibility of the SIO?
Yeah.
And you've talked about how an FLO or a FLO is part of the investigation team. Is that in addition to their welfare responsibilities?
Or for the family.
For the
family. As I say, there's a number of elements to their role.
And as well as the FLO liaising with the family, what could be done in relation to investigating the possibility of racism in relation to police officers who were actually at the scene? Because obviously the family weren't at the scene. So how would you go about investigating the motivation of the officers?
Yes, you would obviously include that as part of your investigative strategy, and well, again, in consultation with the family and understanding where those views were coming from. Again, if it couldn't be explained through open communication, then again, in consultation with them, what they looked for, maybe brought out in witness statements. And again, if I suppose it'd be understanding the allegation in terms of the provenance of that. If it was just a view without any form of support and evidence or information, then I suppose we would just include that as part of the kind of hypotheses, working hypotheses, and then eventually at one point to go back to the family and update them that the investigations we carried out, this is something that we couldn't support, and again just and work with them.
And so would that be done by taking witness statements from civilian eyewitnesses? And would it also assist that part of the investigation to have statements from or accounts from the officers themselves?
Yes.
And then would that allow further consideration to be given as to whether there was any evidence for that line of investigation?
That's correct.
Thank you. Finally, can I ask you about a comment you made earlier today? For those reading the transcript, it's page 58, line 12. You said, as an organisation, we are accepting now that racism exists within policing. And I'd be interested in knowing in what ways, in your experience, is racism in policing demonstrated nowadays?
Well, how do we evidence it, or?
No, how is racism demonstrated within the police service now? How could we see it? Where do we see it? Will I read out the...
No, I can understand it. I suppose it's, what, in terms of like being hidden in plain sight, or?
Yeah, well...
I think by
as
saying
you
that, I
said,
think it
as
was...
an organisation, we are accepting now that racism exists within policing.
Because our communities have told us, our staff have potentially told us.
Right. So it's information that you're gathering in from the community, from the public, and from members of your own staff?
That's correct.
And from police officers themselves?
So what does it say, from communities, the public, and within the organisation, people have told us that it exists.
And these are real life examples that people
I'm
have
unsure
given.
of the specifics, but I'm appreciative from as my view as an organisation, and instead of carrying out the work to identify it exists, as acceptance that it does, and actually putting the effort into eradicate it, because it's got no place in the service and society.
Thank you. Could you just give me one moment, please? Thank you very much. I have no further questions. I would like to say one thing, if I may. In light of the evidence we've heard today and over the past couple of days, it would be my intention to put before you at some stage detailed evidence from the executive of the Police Service of Scotland as to how it has responded to and discharged the recommendations of the Dame Ailish reports, and also to allow you to hear evidence about the equality, diversity and inclusion activity which is being taken forward by the police service and overseen by the Policing Together Oversight Board, chaired by DCC Mrs Taylor. And further, and finally, in light of other evidence we've heard today, that it would be my intention to invite the inquiry team to contact the Police Service Department to gain more information about their work, to also draw that to your attention.
Thank you. Are there any Rule 9 applications? Ms Mitchell? Nobody else. Chief Inspector, would you retire to the witness room, please? Yes, Ms Mitchell.
There are 5 issues that I would like to raise. The first relates to the control measures being used in the room where all the officers were sitting. The issue that I really want to focus in on in particular is timings and who was present in the room. We understand from evidence already given that by 7:39 police officers were told to come back to the station, and by 8 o'clock, I think all but Nicole Short were back at the station and in the canteen. We've heard evidence of this witness explaining that control measures were in place, and those control measures were Sergeant Maxwell, who admitted wasn't independent, but also he indicated that Amanda Given was a control measure. What I would like to discuss or explore with this witness is the timings of Amanda Given when she arrived, where she went, because we understand, or the inquiry may recall, that Amanda Given arrived at the back of 9. She said that, and I'm quoting here from her evidence at paragraph 44.5, it's not a secure part of the building, it's a thoroughfare, so people were coming and going. I left there to go and try and find out what was happening. So she went up and spoke to this witness along with Pat Campbell. She returned at a later stage downstairs again to those that were there. And I want to put to and explore with this witness the fact that she thought somebody else would be the person that would be in control and coming down. And that was in fact what she'd gone up to ask Pat Campbell. The reason why I think this witness might be able to answer is because Amanda Given said that Colin Robson was with Pat Campbell when she was speaking to him. So it's to ask him about those matters, and also to check with him, given the fact that he was a senior officer when these officers got back, who directed the officers to go to the canteen? Did he give them any orders when they arrived not to speak about the incident, or did he give any orders for no one else to go into that room? Finally, something arising from the examination was that in giving his evidence about Sergeant Maxwell and Amanda Given, this witness said at paragraph 53, lines 5 to 7, discussing the fact that they were in the room and effectively were a control measure as he saw it, he says, if they chose after what I had asked to discuss, the Federation rep would be aware whether she was able to disclose that, and Scott Maxwell would as well. And I simply don't understand what he means about whether or not the Federation rep would be able to discuss whether or not anyone had had a conversation. So to ask him what he means by that. And obviously, so that's the first issue I want to explore. The second is around the issue of civilians. This witness was asked at paragraph 59, so would you treat them, meaning police officers, any differently if they had been civilians? And he responded no. And I simply wanted to ask whether or not, if 9 civilians had been involved in restraining someone who died, would they have brought them all together and had them sitting in the one room for a number of hours, unsupervised at times, and ask him, surely they would want to ask them for individual statements. The next issue I want to discuss with the witness, or explore with the witness, is the statement that he gave that Sheikha Bayo ran towards another officer with a knife. Now, the question of what information senior officers had and on what basis they decided that police officers were witnesses or suspects, I would respectfully submit, is going to become a very important matter during the course of the hearing. Therefore, I think it's important to find out where the various stories came from as to things that simply weren't true. For example, when Sheikha Bayo was approached by the police, he didn't have a knife, he didn't have a machete, no officer was stabbed. Yet these reports were being circulated amongst police and amongst the media. And because it's on the basis of such information that senior police officers took this version of events, or it was in fact, in fairness, a number of versions of events that weren't clear, I would like to check with this witness about the leap of faith that he meant in the assumption, and also to ask whether or not he was responsible for other things that the inquiry will come to hear about what senior officers understood the position to be. For example, senior officers who heard that Nicole Short had tripped up and officers went to her aid as Sheikha Bayo was alleged to have a knife. whether or not he had a machete, and to ask this witness if other officers come to court and say that, was that anything that you might have said at any point? Did that come from you? Finally, on that point, I would like to ask this witness, when did his state of knowledge change in relation to what the true picture was in relation to Sheikh Abayo? And when it did he flag it up or bring it to anyone's attention that the original information he gave was incorrect? The fourth issue I would like to discuss with this witness is the issue of resources and separation of the police witnesses, touching on the earlier point that I made. We've heard from other civilian witnesses in this case that they were brought in and separated. We heard from Martin Dick and Kirsty MacLeod that they were separated even as early as leaving their home, taken in separate police cars. And we've heard that Zahid was, when he was with the police, he was kept separate even from his own family, and the inquiry will remember evidence of his own family wishing to speak with him and not being able to speak with him when he was outside his house. So it's to explore with this witness the actual number of rooms in Kirkcaldy Police Station. The witness said that due to resources, where was I going to put them? And it was to explore if there weren't enough places in Kirkcaldy, what else could have happened? If there's a large-scale disturbance, for example, and 5 or 6 people are brought in by police officers and they want to take statements from them, how is that coped with by Police Scotland? Are they taken to another police station? Are there other methods that could have been employed to keep them separate? So asking about that from a resource perspective. The last issue that I want to ask this witness about is race and record keeping. We've heard evidence from this officer about the fact that the views that are held in society that can involve racist, sexist, anti-Semitic, homophobic attitudes, those are matters that can be found in the public, in members of the public, and also clearly can be found within the police force. What I want to explore with this witness is if at the lowest end there are jokes and banter or inappropriate comments, and they're dealt with simply by one person challenging another person, or perhaps simply taking that one level up and speaking to a senior officer, what, if anything, is done about record keeping these incidents? Because what he says in his evidence is, and this is at today at page 31.8, so again, he says, so again, you're relying if it's challenged between the people involved and it doesn't go any further, then I don't know how you can control or ensure if there was line management aware. So he's essentially saying there, if it's just between the two people, then he doesn't know how that would be done. And also, he said, in relation to how these matters would be dealt with if they were raised, he says that what he would do is manage expectations of what they are looking for to do, because it would be a bit remiss if the fact that the actions you took thereafter weren't in keeping with how they wish to have it progressed or resolved. So to ask around that, if the person themselves who has made the complaint says, that's enough, I don't want it dealt with in any other way, I'm happy that it's finished, is that an end to the matter? Would the person who expressed such a views have some record of it in their file or such? And whether or not in that circumstances, if these numbers aren't recorded and statistics can't be gathered on it, how can the inquiry know how much racist, sexist, anti-Semitic and homophobic views can be held by police officers if we don't have this information? Those are my questions.
Thank you. Well, I'll rise to consider this application. I'm going to allow Ms Mitchell to ask questions about the second matter, that's to say, how a group of civilians involved in restraint would have been dealt with. Also, the matter of the physical limitations in Kirkcaldy and the extent of that, and whether other police officers could have been used for separation. And I shall also ask her to allow, I shall allow her to ask questions rather on the record keeping of internal matters relating to racial issues. In respect of the other two matters relating to the canteen and the account of the Mr. Bio running at the officers with a knife, it seems to me there are sufficient evidence from witnesses who've already given evidence, this witness and witnesses who are to come, to allow these matters to be developed in submissions. Can we have the witness back, please? Chief Inspector, Ms Mitchell, who represents the families of Sheikh Bio, is going to ask you some questions. Okay. Ms Mitchell.
I'm obliged. Chief Inspector, I'm going to take you back to a bit of your evidence that you gave us earlier. And you were being asked questions about how you would have treated the police when they returned to Kirkcaldy Police Station. And just for reference, at page 50, lines 9 till 11, you were asked a question by senior counsel to the inquiry, so would you have treated them any differently if they'd been civilians? And your answer to that was no. And I just want to explore that a wee bit. If, for example, you had a large number of people, not necessarily 9, but perhaps anything around that size, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 people. But if they had been involved in restraining someone who had died, and you wanted to bring them all back to Kirkcaldy Police Station to ascertain what had happened, would you have brought them together and placed them all together sitting in the one room?
Potentially, yes. Again, it would be dependent on the circumstances, and I think going back to how I kind of tried to explain the circumstances in terms of the kind of how and why of bringing them back, maybe to gain that control thereafter, if, and again an available resource, if there was a necessity to separate them at that time.
So the two things that you would have in mind are control and resources.
Yes.
So we've already heard in relation to control, and you believe that Scott Maxwell was if not control, then someone who could assist there, and Police Constable Given were two forms that you identified as that you thought were control. If you had brought 9 people back and you didn't know the circumstances of what had happened at the critical time, so exactly the circumstances that we found here, and if those people were simply civilians, so how would you have dealt with them? Would you have brought them back, and would you have brought them all together and had them sitting in one room unsupervised?
Yes, so I have been faced with those circumstances before.
And what did you do in those circumstances?
We brought them back as a collective because there was no other alternative. Having brought them back as a collective in one place, we would then have, as part of that control measures, police officers sitting with that group of individuals.
And in the circumstance, in the example that you gave, what police officers were tasked to do that role? Did they have a specific...
On that day?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think I explained, Scott was there as a supervisor, as a support for welfare, the Federation rep, and again as my account that I had requested someone as independent as possible at that time.
Sorry, that's my fault. I meant in the example that you gave,
Oh yeah.
where you had
So
police
just
officers
the
sent in.
officers that had attended, because the witnesses, that in terms of this hypothetical scenario, which has been obviously does play out on a regular basis, that you would use the available resource at that time, say 2 officers, to control the numbers of witnesses you're referring to, until we had a plan and logistics in place to get the witness statements from them, and as part of that, if there was forensic considerations as well.
And in coming to that matter, would you look in terms of logistics about resources? That's the second
Yes.
thing you came to. Can you explain to us what issues arise then in these circumstances for logistics and resources?
So again, if I brought the number of witnesses back and there was only 2 officers available, if it's 2 officers to deal with each witness, then I would need more resource in terms of whether the plan was to take them away one by one, you would need less resource, or if it was to then separate them, you would need 2 officers, or I would like 2 officers per witness. So effectively, if you're talking 7, 8, then you're talking 14, 16 officers to do that.
And would you have had the capacity to put them in separate places in Kirkcaldy Police Station?
Probably not, just owing to the availability of rooms.
So the 2 limitations on your resources are the officers,
Yeah.
and the number of rooms at Kirkcaldy.
That's correct.
Do you know how many rooms you had out of interest at Kirkcaldy for interviews?
For interviews, there's 2 interview rooms at Kirkcaldy. Again, that's also in conjunction with the custody area as well, so they're in use. There's other rooms that could potentially be used.
I want to move on to a further issue in relation to resources. The inquiry has heard of other civilian witnesses who were brought and they were immediately separated. The inquiry's heard, for example, that 2 people that were asked to come were Martin Dick and Kirsty MacLeod, and they were separated, put in separate police cars, taken separately and dealt with. And they've also heard that Mr. Zaid Said was kept separate, even from his family speaking to him when the police were in his company outside the family home. In those circumstances where the families and the relatives and friends were being dealt with in that way, it would seem that the civilians were being dealt with in a way which was ensuring that they were being kept separate, but not the police.
I think the actions were to take statements from those individuals. Obviously, you can't note the statement from one person in the presence of another witness that you would intend to note a statement from. That there was no intention to separate. I think just by the nature of the action we were performing, they had to be alone when they gave that statement, as opposed to a specific instruction to separate the witnesses.
The inquiry has heard that in terms of resources, what might be suggested as a surplus of officers were also sent to the homes of Martin Dick and also of Zaid Said. So there may well have been resources. Was any consideration given to that, to try and separate them and use some of those resources?
Not that I recall, no.
I'd like to move on to another issue. It's in relation to record keeping in respect of race and some of the evidence that you've given us here today. You've said even in your own experience in WhatsApp group and messages, friends now, I think for reference it's page 51, lines 11 to 18, and you've said that friends don't send things which they think would offend you, perhaps. I'll read the exact phraseology. You said, yes, but to be honest, I think in the friends that I do now have, there's probably a kind of respect that they won't share stuff with me because they know my position on it. And the question was, because of your rank, do you think? And they said, no, just I'm in the police and they know where I stand on these issues. So even within your own friends, there presumably are people expressing views that you do not agree with.
Yes.
Of a nature, as we have been talking about, sexist, racist, those kinds of things. Clearly, in society, we take our police officers from the general public, and in the general public, you've already given evidence that members of the public can hold these views. You gave evidence about the way that issues are flagged up when they are dealt with, if we can perhaps put it this way, when they're dealt with at the lowest level. When someone has heard something that's inappropriate, sexist, homophobic, racist, misogynistic, one of the options is to raise that directly with another person. Mm-hmm. And that can be an end to the matter if that person considers the matter has been resolved satisfactorily. The other way that you explained that it can be done is by raising it effectively one level up. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the matter can be dealt with in that way. And I think what you've said there is that the person who makes the complaint has some degree of agency as to what happens thereafter. They have some degree of involvement in how you would proceed with the matter if someone came to you saying that they'd raised that. Is that correct?
Potentially, yeah.
So just for the sake of the inquiry, that's page 31 today at lines 8 to 11 and 31 lines 16 to 20. I'll just repeat what you said. You said, I suppose it's managing expectations of what they are looking for you to do, because it would be a bit remiss if the fact that the actions you took thereafter weren't in keeping with how they wished it progressed or resolved. So that's, you take into consideration what the person who comes to you with the complaint does. In those two instances, what record keeping is kept of the conversations either between simply two police officers or yourself as a more senior police officer if a more junior person comes to you?
So it could just be exactly in the same scenario with a notebook and or daybook, depending on the circumstances.
And what would then be done with that information if the matter was resolved speaking between the two people, first of all? What would be done? Would that information that you kept in your book go anywhere?
So if, again, in keeping with managing expectations, if it's between two people and they resolve it, I suppose the question is, does it actually get escalated to management? Do they actually have an awareness? We wouldn't know. If it's between two people, then I imagine that would have just been resolved and there'd be no record keeping. My expectation that if it is raised, regardless of the outcome, that it's recorded in some fashion in a notebook, if that's then a matter that needs escalated, like for instance, if it's performance action, in terms of record keeping, it's something we could notify PSD, is the fact that an issue has arisen. If it's been dealt with and resolved at a local level in terms of performance action, just articulate exactly the circumstances for that to be held within police systems in the event of any further incidents that we raised, just to give that background that there's issues existed before.
Okay, so I just want to check if I can go through that in a wee bit more detail. So what you've said is, if two people have that conversation and it's dealt with between those two people, then it may simply be between those two
Yes.
people. It possibly might be recorded in a notebook, but that might be the end of the matter. If it's escalated, if I can just check, and by escalation you mean reporting it to somebody more senior than you and said that this is an issue, there are options that can be taken. Is one of the options of that more senior officer to simply then speak to the person who has said the thing, which is racist, sexist, homophobic or anti-Semitic, and have the matter simply end at that point?
If the circumstances dictated and it wasn't then constituted as anything criminal, yes.
And so is that the test? If it wasn't criminal, nothing would go elsewhere?
It depends. At that circumstances, if the supervisor, and again I'm probably speaking with the hindsight of my experience in PSD, if the supervisor doesn't feel experienced enough to deal with that, again in consultation with the complainer, effectively may seek advice and guidance from senior management or in fact PSD of how to progress that.
Say they don't have that crisis of confidence and they believe that they can deal with the matter by going directly to the person and addressing it with them. How would that be recorded?
So again, it could be recorded in their notebook to outline the discussion that's taken place. If that then corresponds in an interview or meeting with the person that's responsible for these comments, again, note that interaction and any outcome. If they then, and again, best practice would be to share that with senior management and PSD to have that record, because if that's dealt with in isolation, I suppose, in a hard copy, if there was to be further issues, how would you audit that, I suppose?
Indeed. So my first question arising from those issues is, you see, if an interview is required. Now, an interview is presumably more formal than speaking to somebody.
Yeah.
Would it be possible for somebody in the supervisory capacity to simply go and speak to the person without calling a formal meeting? Or would a formal meeting always be called?
I think in terms of keeping themselves right, the fact that there's a formal meeting in also the company of somebody else. So again, the kind of principles of that kind of corroboration following not what is a legal process, but in keeping with that.
Okay. So are you saying that if somebody raises it with a senior officer, there is always an interview and that's always recorded?
Well, if the person who has spoken to best practices, that would be recorded. If not, then to again try and evidence that it ever took place. And that is, again, the basic principles, any contact with the police with.
So you're not aware of any instances, for example, when a more senior officer would simply have a word with a more junior officer?
Again, it's maybe something happened in the past now with the process and procedures that I don't think any supervisory officer, I think it is widely recognised that any interaction with staff in that nature would require to have some form of documentation.
Where does that documentation, if it is raised, where does that documentation go?
So I suppose it would, with the notebook, if it was recorded in a notebook or daybook, I suppose that would have to be transposed on potentially an email, or it then may take the form of a briefing paper or a note to senior management to explain the circumstances and the action the supervisor took. To then,
sorry.
No, and that would be something that could then be sent to PSD. We have more of an electronic database for that information to be recorded onto.
What would be the circumstances in which the further step would be taken, sending it on somewhere else? What's the criteria for the matter being escalated from just being put in a note to sending it to professional standards?
I don't think there's any criteria. If it causes for any circumstances where it's an officer caused to be addressed in terms of how they've behaved, I would like that information to be escalated and then also transmitted to PSD.
Okay, now you say I would like that. Is there a rule on it? Is there a regulation we can go and find that says if this matter comes to you, that's what has to happen?
I'm not sure, to be honest.
So do we know if other officers are following that same view that you do?
I couldn't say.
Okay. So we have this criteria that you say that you would like to, but you're not sure if other officers do that. Is there anywhere else, we'll take the first example of if two people are just talking to one another and they put it in their notebook, is there anywhere else that information would be stored? Would they, for example, ask for it to be put in their colleagues' records?
Yeah, and in terms of record, that would be the PSD element. We hold that internal system for that, so it is.
But if two officers are simply speaking to one another and resolve it that way, would there be any trace of it for being placed on their personal record?
Unless they recorded it, chose to record it, and the fact that if they were given their colleague an opportunity to learn or reflect on their actions, but potentially they made that entry, that would be probably individual.
So that would be the person putting that in their own file, saying this happened and this is how I dealt with it.
And I've had it that the people have approached PSD and supervisors and provided effectively a timeline or catalogue of issues that they've chose to record as they've went, and at a time that they thought or had the confidence to do it, they've raised it.
But that wouldn't be recorded, as it were, against the person who had made the comment?
No, because at that time it wouldn't have been shared.
So if two officers are resolving matters between themselves, unless one officer writes in their own record about what that is, there isn't any record kept at all of that in the other person's records?
Because we would be unaware.
In those circumstances that you've described, if the police officers would be unaware of two officers dealing with these matters by themselves, or in circumstances where there isn't a rule, as far as you know it, to require people who are in a more senior position to pass that on to professional standards, if those numbers are not recorded, how can the inquiry know how much racist, sexist, anti-Semitic or homophobic views are held or expressed by police officers in Scotland?
I suppose it would be difficult to kind of qualify in that, in those circumstances.
No
Thank
further
you.
questions.
Chief Inspector Robson, thank you very much for coming and giving evidence to the inquiry. We're going to rise for the weekend in a moment, and you will then be free to go. So the inquiry will adjourn until Tuesday at 10 a.m.